Hello and welcome to Utopian and Dystopian Fictions, a podcast hosted by me, Matt Leggett, a senior lecturer at the University of Winchester, where I teach utopian and dystopian fiction.
And me, Liam Knight, an independent scholar who holds a PhD in English literature from the University of Birmingham.
In each episode, we interview a different scholar, thinker, or writer, asking them to help us myth bust commonly held assumptions about utopias and dystopias.
If you like what you hear, please let us know by following the podcast, rating it on Spotify, or dropping us a message on utopian and dystopian fictions at gmail.com. So then, Matt, who do we have on this episode?
Well, Liam, I had a lovely morning speaking to Eve Smith, our guest today. She's the author of 4 speculative dystopias, The Waiting Room, which was published in 2020, and is about the crisis in antibiotics. Off Target, published in 2021, which explores ideas around the genetic engineering of children. One, which was published in 2023, which imagines a one-child policy Britain, and her most recent novel, which came out last month, called The Cure, which imagines a world in which a genetic cure for aging has been discovered and sort of, explores, thinks through the implications and ethical debates that might accompany such a discovery. And we were lucky enough to get to read the novel ahead of its publication. I don't know about you, but I really enjoyed it. And I think, there's quite a lot to unpack in the novel. The interview that I had with Eve is largely speaking, if not entirely spoiler free. So if you haven't picked up the book yet and you want to read it, don't let that stop you from listening to the rest of the episode. We do talk about the narrative a little bit. We don't really spoil the plot, I don't think. We just more talk about the setup. For the first part of the interview, we discussed the book and some of its contexts, in particular the problems of population increase, which are obviously further exacerbated by this cure for aging that is discovered in the novel, but also things like our fascination with immortality more generally. And then in the reading that Eve gives from the novel, one of the characters asked simply, why wouldn't you have the rejuve? Why wouldn't you have this therapy that just keeps you young forever, pretty much? This rejuve is the name she gives to her rejuvenation therapy. It's a question that I think, certainly prompts us to think about our own response to such a possibility, and really aligns the novel with other texts that have explored bioethical concerns, which I think is, I would suggest is a really prominent or even maybe a dominant strand of dystopian fiction today and throughout the 21st century. As the interview developed, Eve sort of made some assertions, I think, about sort of the problems of the current speed of technological development, particularly in the biotech industry, the way it might be outstripping our ability to really think through the implications of such developments, and maybe undermines our efforts to regulate this sort of field. And she also spoke extensively about the process of writing the novel and the research that went into it. So if you're interested in, writing a speculative fiction novel, or you're the process of it, this is, I think, a really good interview to listen to. We spoke quite a bit about her approach to world building, her influences, and also some of the humor in her book, but also sort of dystopian fiction more generally. And then just at the end, the interview closed with a discussion about the future of biotechnologies and whether we can expect dystopia rather than utopia to emerge from these advancements, and sort of questioning who really controls this stuff.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. It was a really, really interesting interview, and also a really, really interesting novel. And thanks again to Eve's publishers for getting in touch with us regarding doing an episode, and for sending across to us both proof copies of the novel. I think
we were actually, weren't we? We were thinking about doing, a novelist at some point, and this kind of landed right in our inbox at the right time, didn't it? So it was great, and it was good that we got the novel, and then it was really interesting as well. So it's a double whammy, and also that Eve is such a brilliant speaker. I really enjoyed chatting to her. What you don't hear in this is that the interview is about 40 minutes, but I spoke to her for about half an hour before and about half an hour after the interview ended as well, because we just were having a great time. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm quite jealous to have missed it. It seemed like a really good interview, and Eve, was a really brilliant speaker. Thanks for sort of highlighting sort of the bioethical sort of strand to the novel. I think for me that was one of the more interesting sort of themes and ideas that was coming through in it. It made me think of a lot of dystopian fiction that sort of ruminates on this topic. I know in the interview itself you mentioned "Never Let Me Go" by Ishiguro, and I was thinking as well of a Swedish dystopia called The Unit by a writer called Ninni Holmqvist, which isn't. It is too bad that novel is more aligned with Never Let Me Go, perhaps, than it is The Cure. But I think there's still a through line between them in which that novel predominantly features older characters, and there's maybe a question in both novels about, what do we do with the elderly in a society? What's sort of what's their purpose, their use, their function? If we can talk about human beings in that sort of language, and in Eve's novel, the older characters are sort of put to work in a sort of volunteer program of doing sort of maybe light labor, light jobs, as a result of having their lifespans extended. Whereas in Holmqvist's, there's more of a emphasis on actually harvesting the bodies of the old, and putting them to use. I'm saying in scare quotes or inverted commas, in that way. Matt, what other sort of key strands or ideas really stood out to you from the novel?
I think just to respond to that quickly, I think there's it is a really interesting strand of debate, and I can see this novel challenging students perhaps as well, because it is a pressing issue. I don't, although we haven't got the rejuve therapy yet that Eve kind of speculates here, although I think it's entirely plausible that we will be able to turn back the kind of genetic clock at some point, which is obviously what she's imagining here. Even without that, the problem of an aging population is a real one, and young people in particular are, I think, feeling a little bit disenfranchised in this world we've created, where certain generations, I suppose, are clinging on. Not, it's not that they're clinging onto life; it's more that they're clinging to power. I
Yeah,
think that's when you look at the sort of presidential race in the US, and you've got octogenarians involved.
mm,
It's what does that mean for our ability to sort of imagine a future? And so I think I do think that this would be a sort of interesting novel to explore with students. So I think they would get a bit of a kick out of it. And I think it doesn't take too much for them to imagine this kind of a world. Um, and in some ways, I think this is a bit of a kind of critical dystopia. I know we've
mm,
talked about this term on the podcast before. It's a really sort of uh, a prominent term in sort of academic thought on dystopias, and we could go right back to the first episode of the podcast with Raffaella
yeah,
Bacalini, where we talked about the critical dystopia, as she was one of the sort of inventors, if you like, of that term. And Lyman Tower Sargent has said that the critical dystopia in particular suggests that the possibility of utopia, the positive kind of possibility that is, exists within some dystopias. But the problem is how to actualize the utopia and get rid of the dystopia.
mm,
And I kind of think that's relevant here, because what you've got in this novel is you've got, in principle, a technology which is in many ways deeply utopian, right? It's
yeah,
deeply positive. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
who
yeah.
wouldn't want one of these redos? Who wouldn't want to sort of turn back their, if you get to 60, 70, 80, you wouldn't want to just turn back the clock and be 30 again. You would. It's a utopian idea, as fraught with kind of ethical problems as the idea of living forever is. You would probably grasp it if you could.
Mm,
So there is a kind of utopia at the heart here, but the problem is that the architecture of the world that she imagines is the same architecture as we have today.
yeah,
That's where the realistic sort of element comes in, and so you've got the world being dominated by these sort of figures like the kind of Elon Musk's and Jeff Bezos figures of the world, who they have their own agenda. They've got all the power, all of the wealth, and one of the interesting areas of the text for me was the kind of class divisions in the novel, which are exacerbated, understandably, by this rejuve therapy, which the super rich can afford, and most people can't. And again, I thought that was a really interesting element of the text.
Yeah, I was thinking earlier about the text, and I'm really glad you've mentioned critical dystopia and the novel's relationship with utopianism, because I was also reading it as maybe being a bit of an anti-utopia. We're saying that there's this big utopian potential in having this age-reversing therapy or drug, but also as it appears really, really early in the novel, so I wouldn't really call it a spoiler at all. But the scientist protagonist, Ruth, discovers this cure for aging by accident almost, trying to find a cure for a disease that took the life of her young daughter. And again, like the utopian impulse there of this scientist to find a cure for a disease that's taken a loved one from her, and then how that's sort of been warped and spiraled and bastardized by competing scientists and capitalistic pressures and sort of politicians' desire to grab power and really keep hold of power. I thought was really interesting, because it's this one individual's really utopian aim has been totally and utterly warped. And there's a setting later in the novel that I won't go into in great depth, but again, it has all of the semblance of utopianism, and I know that you know what I'm talking about here. Readers, I call you readers all the time, listeners, if you read the novel, you'll find what I mean too. But that setting as well has all the trappings of utopia, and yet is so clearly dystopian. And so again, it's like a really anti-utopian space. Thank you so much for asking Eve about the additional texts that are again littered or scattered.
Endotexts.
They are
Use your own
endotexts.
term here, Liam.
I know, but I'm embarrassed. No, yeah, the endotexts that are scattered throughout the main narrative. We have probably, I don't know, maybe every like 6 or 7 chapters, I'll say on average. Maybe it's an advert or a newspaper article, a news story, etc. That does it does that really elegant move of setting the scene and contextualizing some of the events in the novel, or like the history of the story world. And I think I really valued Eve's discussion of it, because it's it's always nice to hear authors talking about the things that you're really interested in, right? But something that really stood out to me whilst reading it is that in my argument, these additional texts, as in the argument in my thesis, these endotexts crystallize the major thematic preoccupations of a novel. And although all of the endotexts in Eve's novel, these newspaper articles, adverts, and so on, they are centered around the rejuve drug in some way. There's a huge undercurrent to them that relates to either political power or to, again, capitalistic pressures. The fact that the very first one, that more or less opens the novel, is an advert, to me, brings these questions into it. It's not, this novel is not about, ooh, science is bad. The novel is perhaps more about what happens when the people in charge of, or informing, or really guiding and directing the science are business people, are money makers, are people desperate for power in whatever form that is. And so that was really, again, like really interesting for me, because I think it's easy in speculative fiction, in sci-fi, in dystopias, in whatever, to have the mad scientist as the bad guy. But I think it's more interesting and maybe pertinent right now for the bad guy to not be the scientist, but to be maybe the multi-billionaire funding their pockets instead.
Yeah, and I think actually as well, one thing I'd add with that is and I'd say this in the interview, I really looked forward to those adverts and those sections, and it could have been done really badly.
Yes.
So that those sort of techniques can be quite cliche, right, in some capacity, but I just think it works really well. There was something there was something that felt true about those adverts, but that
Mm.
also made you smile.
Yeah.
I think that's what I liked about them, and I felt like that at a number of points in the novel, actually.
Yeah, yeah. I think not to go on, but I know you talk to Eve quite a bit about satire and moments of humour in these texts, and there were moments, especially these end of texts, where there was a bit of humour. I think one of the late end of texts as well, and this is a moment of prescience that you and Eve don't touch upon, but you do have moments of prescience. Is the major competing political party in the story world are called the Reformist Party, which is it's an alarm bells ringing for me. Reading it only sort of earlier this week. It was really alarming.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I do think that there's a lot in this novel that made me feel like, yeah, I can totally see that this is this is the way the world is going. Yeah, it is a nicely rounded, there is a good balance, I think, between stuff that's supposed to be satirical, that's supposed to make you, just smirk a little bit, cut through the really kind of grim nature of it. And
Mm.
then, because one of the things that I think, maybe this goes back to the interview with Nathan Waddell that I want to say he maybe touched on this idea that there's a kind of competition who can write the worst dystopia. I
Yeah.
read this a lot, right? There's this just an awful, bleak world is depicted where there's just no hope and everyone is evil, apart from the protagonist, perhaps. And that's just not how it would happen,
Mm.
right? I mean, I think we know that, but it's like almost like a competitive thing. Who can make the worst, most horrible dystopia? I'm reading one at the moment. It's called the Unnamed Midwife, by Meg Ellison, and I'm not that far in, and it may well change, but it's intensely graphic and
Mm.
difficult to read, and it feels a little bit like that sort of competitive, who can write the worst dystopia. And I think, this in this novel, I think she avoids doing that. I think she
Yeah.
goes for something that feels much more like, yeah, this could happen. And in doing so, it does make you think a bit more. It does make you sort of a bit worried about it. It's less easy to dismiss this, yeah, I think. And the ethical principles and concerns are valid ones. And I think if we do stop and think about some of these technologies and who's really directing, our efforts, who's really going to make the decision that's in the best interests of
Mm.
humanity, or the general public. These are genuine questions, and I don't think the novel necessarily. I mean, I think it suggests that there are certain people that shouldn't be in charge of these things, but I don't think it goes as far as to say that there are clear-cut answers to these problems.
Mm.
It doesn't treat the reader like an idiot in that sense. I think it maintains a distance and asks us those questions to reflect on them ourselves, which I think is great.
Yeah. Well, I think we've been skirting around the book and the interview a fair bit now, Matt. So how about we pass over to yourself and Eve?
Yeah, absolutely. We've been avoiding the spoilers, haven't we?
Yes,
We
we
can
have.
desperately trying to say stuff about the novel that we can without ruining the plot. So yeah,
Yes.
let's hand over to the interview. So I'm delighted to have with me today on the podcast Eve Smith, our first author for the podcast. Eve, would you mind introducing yourself to the audience?
Sure. So I am the author of 4 speculative thrillers. I came to writing relatively late after pursuing other careers in corporate and in conservation. And I've written 4 novels. So the first was The Waiting Rooms, my debut, about an antibiotic resistant pandemic. And that came out in 2020, just as we went into COVID lockdown, which was interesting. My second one, Off Target, is about a world where genetic engineering of children has become routine. My third novel, One, was out in 2023, and that's about a one-child policy Britain ravaged by climate change. And my latest novel has literally just come out, called The Cure, about the discovery of a cure for aging, which has fairly disastrous consequences for people and planet.
Yeah, I've been reading The Cure. I was very fortunate enough to be sent a pre, what do you call them? I don't know, preview copy,
Proof
etc.
copy, yeah.
Yeah, which has been really great. And really enjoyed reading it. In particular for me as a scholar of utopian dystopian fiction, really enjoyed the world building aspects of it. Might
Thank
you
you.
tell the audience a little bit more about the premise of that novel? And I hope you don't mind if we kind of focus on that novel more in this interview. I'm sure
Yeah,
we'll
sure.
touch on other novels that you've written, but I should said, by the way, I introduced you as our first author. We have interviewed quite a lot of other authors. I should say first novelist rather than author that we've interviewed.
Fiction.
I probably otherwise upset quite a lot of our previous guests. Um,
No
but
problem.
yes, yeah. So could you just tell us that I suppose
Yeah.
the premise for the novel would be helpful. Thanks.
Sure. So the premise really is, what would happen if we discovered a cure for aging, and how much would people risk to stay young? So I have a science protagonist, Ruth, and she stumbles across this genetic cure that can reverse old age whilst she's actually researching the disease that killed her young daughter. And she knows that this discovery is huge. And she tries to contain it, but unfortunately, it's hijacked by a very ambitious colleague called Eric Grundlegger, who develops a super premium upgrade with disastrous consequences. And so this really shatters Ruth's life, and she becomes something of a recluse until decades later she meets this young investigator called Mara, whose job it actually is to hunt down people that made and took this super premium cure. And the two form an unlikely alliance. And I had the idea for the novel when I was writing the previous novel, One, which was, as I say, about one child policy Britain. And I thought, well, what would happen at the other extreme if our population rocketed, not because of increased births, but because of fewer deaths? Because the reason actually that our global population is increasing now isn't because of increased fertility rates, it's because people are living longer. And in fact, the population has more than doubled since the start of the last century. So in 1900, the average global life expectancy was 32, and now it is 73. But the trouble is that our health span isn't keeping up with our lifespan. So many people spend the last decades of their life in very poor health, suffering from chronic conditions. So this massive industry has sprung up where people are literally investing billions in trying to work out a way to turn back the clock and stave off these degenerative diseases, which are all associated with old age, like heart disease and strokes and pulmonary disease. They're all associated with aging. And I wanted to figure out, well, if one of these people does actually find the holy grail, what is going to happen given that we're on a planet where resources and space are already running out?
So I suppose that the spoiler alert, if you hadn't already picked that up, is that it's a dystopia rather than a utopia. Because of course, I think you could have easily, I suppose, imagined this, or maybe it's more difficult to imagine it, I suppose, as in a positive light. But it seems like a positive development. People are looking for this thing
Mm,
because, as you say, the Holy Grail, it's gonna transform things in a positive way. But it has these side effects that you explore in the novel. That was really great, and we'll get stuck into the novel a little bit more in a moment. But I wondered if there was a section of the novel that you might want to read, a brief
yeah,
section maybe that you feel captures the feel of the novel a little bit, to
yeah,
give the audience
sure.
a sense of it.
Yes, absolutely. So the chapter I've chosen is near the start of the book, and it's actually from the perspective of Ruth, who is my science character. I have dual perspective in the novel, both Ruth, my scientist, and Mara, the investigator. So Ruth at this point is 115, a little whippersnapper at 115. And ironically for her, well, the government has introduced a law, I should state, where in order to try and control the population explosion that has happened as a result of this cure for aging, everyone basically has a life limit of 120. And when you reach 120, you, inverted commas, transcend, which basically means you are euthanized, a bit like Logan's Run, which I think you were going to mention. And the other key issue that the government has tried to address is the growing intergenerational divide, where the young who have been out of work, homeless, and facing a very difficult situation, have become very disenfranchised with the elderly, who they blame for this situation. You've taken the cures. And so the government has introduced national service for people once they hit their century. So for the last 20 years of your life, you are compelled to do national service. And you get that. That is a sort of thing that you sign up to in response to getting the Rejuve cure, which you get on the NHS. So with that introduction, we join Ruth, who ironically has been given the national service job of working in one of the clinics that issues the Rejuve vaccine, which is this cure for old age. And we join her at the start of the day. And the only other thing I should say, so that this chapter makes sense, is that the injection that I was referring to earlier, that Ruth's colleague developed, this super premium upgrade, is called the Superjuve, and the people that took it are called supers. I grab my bag and sway to the front as the train approaches a high turret that looks like an old watchtower. When the Rejuve scheme first launched, it was run out of the hospital complex up the hill. But once age-related conditions disappeared, they didn't need all those wards, so they were turned into flats. The maternity centre and the children's hospital are still there, and of course A&E. Some rare cancers persist, but with the rise in depression and other psychological disorders, the largest division by far is mental health. I face the scanner. Clinician Ruth Sharp reporting for duty. I head down a corridor coated with posters, part-time study courses, fitness studios and yoga groups. One is a plug for national service, photos of grinning centenarians looking active and fulfilled. Make the last 2 decades of your life really count. I unlock the treatment room. My appointments are back to back. The screen tells me my first client has arrived. He has a chronological age of 90. I pop my head round the door. Mr. Bolden, he jumps up. Please follow me. I discreetly scan him as he walks in. Broad-chested, with a mane of thick blonde hair. The skin has not lost its elasticity, nor the muscles their definition. There's the odd wrinkle, but no age spots or sags. I remember when the passing of years was etched on our bodies, the clues to a lifespan worn for all to see. Now we are as avatars, unchanging. So, Mr. Bolden, let's get the admin out of the way. You know the drill. Before you sign, I have to read out the official statement. He clenches his hands in his lap and nods. David Bolden, in order to qualify for this Rejuve booster, you are obliged to meet all eligibility criteria listed under the National Rejuve Scheme. This includes paying into an accredited pension scheme for a minimum of 60 years, adhering to the dietary, drug and exercise stipulations, and fulfilling your national service obligations, after which your life term will be complete. Do you understand and consent to these terms? I do. I activate the wall screen as he scrawls his name. His health vitals flicker into view. Your scan was normal. DNA methylation rates indicate some aging, but I see you missed your last appointment, which probably explains it. He doesn't volunteer any explanation. Normally they're busting down the door for their next fix. I run my tongue over my lip. Did you have any side effects after your last Rejuve? Or was there anything about the procedure that troubled you? His eyes drop to the floor. Nothing medical, no. Ah, so that's it. Were you targeted? Bolden scrapes his thumb over his knuckles and nods. A man followed me after my last Rejuve. I didn't realize at the time. They waited until I'd gone to work, then came to the house. I got a call from my wife. She was terrified. His lips tremble. They sprayed stuff over the walls. Disgusting things. I mean, why wouldn't you have the Rejuve? My dad died of heart failure in his early 50s. It was devastating. I didn't want the same for my family. I'm sorry, but just to reassure you, I can't remember there ever being trouble here, and I've worked in this clinic for 15 years. I crouch down, open the fridge and select a rejuve vial. Haven't you heard about the protests? He says. They found another one yesterday. It's not official yet, but it was leaked. Another what? Super. They busted one of those illegal labs that do knockoff rejuves. Dead body outside, the works. So now the campaigners have got all fired up again. He brandishes his screen. A reporter is standing in front of a cordon. Police are everywhere. A man's mugshot flashes up. That's him, says Bolden, the super who was shot. I stare at the hollow chin, the piercing grey eyes. I blink. My eyes must be playing tricks, surely. I tear the needle out of its wrapper and fumble it onto the syringe. Please don't worry yourself, Mr. Bolden. The security here is very good. I muster something approaching a smile. Left arm or right? Right, please. He rolls up his sleeve. I focus on the scatter of moles above his elbow, the deltoid muscle tensing for the jab. Ready to be 35 again? Hell yes. The needle slides in without protest. I thumb the plunger down. I was against all that super nonsense from the start. I knew it wouldn't end well, says Bolden. Not that I could ever have afforded it, but even so, going on and on forever. He sighs. Frankly, I don't know why anyone would. He carries on talking, but I'm not listening. The buzzing in my ears intensifies. It cannot be the same person. It's not possible. The man whose image I just saw has already been murdered 13 years ago.
Right, a really neat section there. I think I didn't know what you were going to choose, but I think that really captures a lot of the aspects of the novel, including, at the end, that kind of thriller aspect that sort of drives the novel, but it also does a lot of kind of work in setting up some of the, I suppose, key interesting debates that you're engaged in here. So I mean, all of your novels, you've already mentioned them, The Waiting Room's Off Target one, and obviously now The Cure. They all seem to be at least connected in some way to the field of bioethics or biotechnology. Is that a sort of interest for you? And what about that sort of makes it a particularly ready subject for dystopia, do you think?
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. I'm fascinated by science and scientific discovery, and particularly the whole biotech area, because I think the pace of and scale of discovery in those fields is accelerating, enabled by huge advancements in big data and genetics and AI. And the issue here is I think there's a danger that the speed of these advances in fields like tech and medicine is outrunning our ability to really anticipate or grasp the long-term impacts. I mean, let alone agree between nations or even ourselves how we should regulate these tools or decide who gets access to them and for what purpose or at what cost. So I think this makes it a sort of really rich area, and it's a sort of classical literary sort of mining field, isn't it? The scientist whose invention outgrows him or her and whose discovery has sort of drastic, unforeseen consequences. And that's really, the motivation behind my character, Ruth. I wanted to explore what it would be like to have set out with the best intentions and then lose control of your own discovery and then have to face up to the tragedy of it being abused by others, ultimately with horrendous consequences. Because
Yeah. I was going to say, I think that's
scientists
quite a smart move, because I think, with Ruth, obviously you've got this figure who is, it would be easy to blame the scientists, I suppose, here, but you've got one of
Yes.
your central figures as a kind of scientist who has, good intentions. And I think, most of the people involved in this area, they do have good intentions, absolutely. But if you can't foresee what's going to happen to this treatment or what's going to happen in the long term or what you're part of, you're at the mercy of other people and other vested interests, often big business, which is another kind of theme I think that comes through here. And class is written all over this text, which I thought was really interesting as well.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I think it's this whole dilemma, isn't it, that once the the genie's out of the bottle, you can't put it back. And related to that, I included at the start of the novel, I always like to include quotes and from that are relevant to the themes in the book. And you'll have seen the quote that I gave from Oppenheimer, which isn't the classic one that everybody thinks of, Destroyer of Worlds, which I include actually in the narrative in the book. But it was one that I found, which it actually gave me goosebumps when I first read it, because it's the speech that he did to the American Philosophical Society after the bombs had dropped in 1945. And he asked that question whether knowledge is a good in itself, knowledge and such power as comes with it. And it's interesting that he defends that position even so soon after the atomic bombs have dropped. And it's a question I wanted to give to readers. That's one of the classic, I'll discuss this at your book club, because
we were kind of doing this yesterday with my students. Actually, it came up in conversation, and we were talking about technology. I've kind of noticed a lot more cynicism toward technology from young people over the last 10 years in particular. And I think back to when I was growing up, and I think I was growing up in the 1990s primarily, and I kind of think back at that as a sort of time of optimism about technology, a brief moment of optimism, where I think because you've got the sort of birth of the internet and computing technology, it was quite exciting at the time. And then, as you say, it's sort of only 20-30 years later that you see the real side effects of that, where people are becoming sort of addicted to this kind of technology, and it's affecting people's communication skills. And I think people are quite cynical about the future that these technological developments will bring. And I think your novel definitely taps into that. I suppose this leads me to another question I had, which was about the research that went into this, because I think that passage really demonstrated that you've thought a lot about the kind of implications of this development of the rejuve. And I wondered how much, not necessarily how much time, but sort of how much effort, who were you talking to, how much work goes into these kinds of novels?
Yes, well, unlike many, I love the research aspect. And in fact, I really sometimes have to drag myself back out of the rabbit hole, because I could quite happily spend, months doing my research. So, but I actually think it's very important, because the books I write are dealing with these big issues. And for me, plausibility is key. Because also a lot of readers of this particular genre of speculative fiction are scientists or medics or work in the tech world. So I like, even though I don't necessarily, it is fiction at the end of the day, but for me it's important to have it grounded in fact. So I really take my time on this. So I'm very lucky that normally through a network of a network of a network, you can normally get access to experts in different fields. So I always try and track down an expert in whatever issue it is that I'm pursuing. So in The Cure, the rejuve therapy and then the naughty upgrade superjuve, they are both genetic. They have their basis, they're genetic cures effectively that fundamentally are altering the way our bodies are constructed. They are changing our cellular biology. And in order to understand how that could work, I spoke to two geneticists that actually have helped me on my second book, Off Target, which is about playing around with the genes of your unborn children. So I went back to them and they foolishly said yes. And it's just, there is no substitute for talking to people who work in the field, because you don't know what you don't know. So I have, I start out with an idea for a plot, and I know what I think I want to happen. But I don't know if it can happen or not. So I have to first of all find out if such a thing is possible. And I knew there was so much work going into it, and I'd already come across quite a few science, blogs and videos and interviews that for people working in this field. So I already knew this was a possibility. But then because I have a research protagonist, Ruth, I need to get a level lower, right? Because I've got scenes based in her lab, and I simply couldn't write those chapters if I didn't understand the details. So I was really lucky in that one of these geneticists actually took me to work with her for the day. So I got to shadow her, you know, and she works in this, you know, Oxford University Research Institute. And I was literally like a child in a, you know, sweet shop. I was so excited. So I was like, what, you know, going around with my lab coat and everything on, you know, watching what she was doing, scribbling madly all the curious terms I'd never heard before and the names of the complicated machines, and taking pictures of absolutely everything. And, you know, it was invaluable, because that is what enabled me to write those lab-based chapters, and also to understand that whole painstaking, meticulous nature of research, and just how long term it is, you know. So experts are key, and I've been very lucky on each book I've been able to access a particular researcher in the field. And then the other thing is that because I live near Oxford, you know, there are so many talks and lectures and events, most of them free actually, that go on all the time. So I'm able to access those, and I often go along. And again, you know, that's invaluable, because you pick up from people the language, because language is so important, the language of that particular discipline or area or issue. You know, you pick up through this, you know, ideas for plot points, just as I do with the conversations with the experts, you know, because they'll come up with something and I'll think, oh my God, oh, I can use that for this thing over here. And it can materially change the plot arc of your novel. And then, of course, there's the good old internet, and it is phenomenal what you can access on Google. I mean, a lot of research papers are open domain, so I can get access to those, you know, and it's incredible what people do put out on the internet. I mean, I've found all kinds of bizarre policy papers that I'm fairly sure shouldn't be in the public domain, but have ended up there. So yeah, I think the I don't always kind of been slightly concerned about what governments were looking at my search history. It wouldn't be very good, but it is, you know, it is. I just can't believe how I wouldn't be able to write the novels I write now if there was not the internet. I don't think. I honestly, it would take me decades to go to a library and find all this stuff. So I feel very fortunate that we are in this world that we are.
Yeah, it really pays off. I suppose, you know, one of the classic pieces of advice to give writers is always write what you know. But I suppose what's kind of interesting about that example is you are writing what you know because you're going out and you're doing the research, but you're not coming to it from a point of knowing much about it in the first place. So you're not really kind of writing what you know in that sense. And as you say, maybe that's particularly made possible by you know, the tools we have at our disposal today, which is really interesting. Yeah, in a recent episode, we spoke to an Orwell expert, Nathan Waddell, and one of the things he said that he looks for in a dystopian text is what he called a kind of a certain type of elegance, perhaps in the way that the writer depicts the world. And I wondered if we might talk a little bit about your writing style or your approach to this. So obviously,
Sure.
in a dystopian novel, there's a lot of world building that needs to take place, and you know, I'm obviously conscious that as a writer, I'm sure you're looking to do this subtly as well, not just you know, dump a kind of massive sort of exposition on the reader. And I you know, one of the things I really liked about this novel was these kind of snippets that we get, particularly when you open the book with an advert for one of these rejuves, and I think it does a huge amount of heavy lifting in terms of one page, but tells you a lot about the kind of world you're entering. I thought that was really neat. And kind of contrast, I suppose, you also have a fairly lengthy sort of dialogue, which also fleshes out this world quite a bit. So I
Yes.
wondered if you might just say a little bit about your approach and how you get that balance right, between kind of just telling the reader and maybe showing them, perhaps.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it is the classic that we all have to grapple with, which is show, don't tell. So as you say, I do really love using different sort of narrative formats, and adverts and newspaper articles I use in all my books, because, you know, they are such an efficient way for conveying the changes in your world. And they're also very engaging, hopefully. And I actually think sometimes, you know, like you said about the advert for the Rejuve, you know, helping you and your family grow young. It can be quite shocking, actually, because you are able to demonstrate through advertising a cultural shift that it might take a whole page of exposition to describe. And so I use them a lot, because I always start out thinking about what are all the different aspects of society and the world that will be different, and how are they different. And then I plot out. I actually love the adverts. They're one of my favorite bits. Are adverts and the news articles that I'm going to do to reflect some of those changes. And of course I seed in and drip feed those changes throughout the narrative in each chapter, but the adverts are almost like a short, sharp hit. So I'm really pleased you like those, because they're one of my favorite parts, actually.
Yeah, I actually, weirdly enough, found myself looking forward most to these sort of things. So look, you could look ahead and say, "Oh, there's going to be a little newspaper section coming soon." And it's weird to say that you know, I found myself looking forward to that. I think that's probably because of what I teach and my interest, rather than because that, you know, that's more compelling than the thriller element. Because I don't think that's the case at all. But yeah, I really like those. I'm glad you kind of continued with them, and it wasn't just a sort of trick for the opening as well. So yeah,
Oh,
I
that's
liked
good.
that. And
Yeah.
the novel kind of treads an interesting line as well, because obviously the premise, I thought at least, is kind of highly plausible. It felt quite real, partly because of that research you've talked about, partly because of these kinds of, you know, adverts and newspaper cuttings and these elements. But it was also satirical, so you know, it did make me laugh a few times. I hope it was intent. I hope I'm not just saying that that's a surprise to you. I'm sure that you probably had that in mind. But I mean, you know, uh, this isn't a spoiler because right near the beginning of the
No,
novel you
not
get
at all.
this, but Jeff Busk is the name of the tech entrepreneur who founds Geno City, or Geno City. And
Yeah.
you know, there is this sort of sense that sometimes the closer you get to real life, the more like a kind of satire it becomes, and the more like a
Yeah.
farce it becomes. So do you think that's something, is that something you do intentionally? Is there a sense that you think maybe a good dystopian text is, you know, has to cut through the darkness with some humor maybe here or there, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I do. I mean, yes, I do it deliberately. I mean, I think dystopia has a free reign. It can be all entirely dark, you know, it can be fantastical, it can be based on reality. But because I write about these real world issues, and I like imagining how future scenarios play out, I tend to keep it quite grounded in the real, because I think that makes it more frightening. But so I do use moments of humor just as a bit of light relief, just to sort of break it, particularly because, you know, my novels straddle, you know, speculative fiction, which is classically termed sci-fi, although it's very different, and thriller genre. I straddle those two genres, so I have to keep up the pace. And I think that makes my novels are a bit different to pure speculative fiction or sci-fi, because they tend to be much longer. They have the luxury of time, whereas I've got to keep going, keep pages turning. And so, and also it sort of necessitates quite a lot of darkness. People are expecting death and destruction. So I do use these moments of humor, I think, just to give a little pause and a bit of light relief. But I would say, you know, Jeff Busk, yeah, I just love that name. I'm so glad I did it as well, given, you know, given, like, you know, I'm working sort of 2 years ago when I was coming up with
Mm.
that one, given everything that's happened in the meantime. So I would say it's humor with a sharp edge, because, you know, sadly, you know, the reality is that many tech, finance, and retail billionaires are the ones investing in billions in these anti-aging cures. Because guess what? And I literally heard it from the mouth of the head of a gene therapy company at an event I went to in Oxford. They don't want to die. Yeah,
Mm.
they want to hang on to their empires,
Yeah.
so they can make a few more billion. And so, you know, what are a few million or billion for them putting it over here into this research, if it means that they get to hang around a bit longer? So, you know, it is very real. The satire, it is satire, but, you know, Jeff Busk is based on reality.
Mm. Well, they're all the same person, really. That's the other thing, you know, that it brings to mind, you know. So yeah, I thought
Yeah,
that was good. And theirs is our utopia, really. I mean, they live the life. They can do whatever they want, really. Money
yeah,
is no object for them. So why not make that last a bit longer? Absolutely.
yeah,
I think that also sort of leads us to thinking about kind of some of the class-based elements of the novel, which again I thought were really interesting. So, I mean, I don't know what you would say are your major influences. I certainly sort of read a little bit of kind of Naomi Alderman, Christina Dowker in there. I thought perhaps the novel that this made me think of most was Vox, I think, by Christina Dowker. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but I think that also uses the kind of, I think it's the sort of, it has a kind of thriller aspect also, but also has
Yes.
the sort of scientific background of one of the central characters, which kind of gave that, I think. But yeah, and also the in relation to some of the kind of found objects of the text, sort of Alderman's text likes to do that, sort of alongside the plotted page turner element. So, but yeah, in terms of the subject area, where I thought yours was, I thought actually more interesting than something like Vox, which you know, I liked in some capacity. I like the premise. Often I like the premise of dystopian text, but then sometimes the delivery is not always that interesting. Like it relies too heavily on the premise. Whereas I liked this because there was just more to it. I thought your the way in which you really sort of play out the logic of class in the text worked really well, and sort of maybe linked it to other texts more like sort of 1984 or something like Altered Carbon. I thought would be a good reference point as well, which is by Richard Morgan. So I don't know, you may or may not have read any of these. I'm sure you've read 1984, but
Yeah.
yeah, I wonder if you might say a bit about how conscious you are maybe about these other writers in the field. How much are you taking from them or inspiration from them, or how much are you trying to maybe differentiate from them when you're working?
Yes. Well, I mean, I read quite widely, not just in my genre, because I do truly believe that you learn something as a writer from every book you read. I mean, I'd possibly make an exception for cozy crime because I favor the darker or the emotional stories. Those are the sort of areas I gravitate to. So no, I'm absolutely familiar with the writers you mentioned, but I would probably say my key role model, if you like, would be Margaret Atwood. I'll just never forget. I mean, I'm of an age where I saw the original film of The Handmaid's Tale, which I think was 1986, was it? And I literally will never forget seeing it. I saw it with my sister, and I literally ran out and bought the book, and then just read everything I could get my hands on by her, because I just think her imagination of these close future worlds and the issues that she outlined so beautifully. I think she is the queen. And then the other one I would say, my favorite film of all time is Blade Runner. And so when I found out that it was based on, Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, I sort of ran out and bought everything I could from that he'd written as well. So that I would say was a major influence. And then the other one would be Ian M. Banks. So Ian Banks, who I also love, but his sort of supposed sci-fi incarnation. I was really fascinated by the worlds he built in his culture novels, where he had just imagined this whole sort of political landscape at a galactic level, but it was done through these really compelling relationships and people, and our failings. It was so compulsive, that sort of combination of political comment, but also very engaging personal storytelling, that I try to do something like that. Not as well, but I try to emulate that in my writing.
Is this kind of fiction really important, do you think, in helping people, policymakers, think about the dangers of scientific discovery? Is that something you have in mind when you're writing? Are you hoping that Jeff Busk is going to pick this up and maybe think twice about the rejuve, or what do you think?
Sadly, I think the Jeff Busts of this world are unlikely to think anything other than their own thoughts, but we can dream. I mean, in terms of, does fiction have a role to play? Absolutely, because we're in a position now where tech and science is advancing at such a pace, as I touched on earlier, and I think the general public, they need to be aware of what's happening, but we're constantly bombarded by facts and stats and fake news, and everything's moving at such pace. You know, do people even have a chance to pause to register some of the issues or know what is real, or, you know, let alone work through the implications? So if somebody picks up a novel, you know, we've got the luxury of time in a novel. You know, that's 300,000 plus words as opposed to what, you know, 500 in an article. So that is a real opportunity to engage somebody's heart and mind in a way that no quick article or tweet can. And so I think that that is a very powerful mechanic to try and get people to just think about what's going on and potentially engage. You know, and I get feedback from readers, which I absolutely love, which is they say, you know, I couldn't stop thinking about the book long after I turned the last page. And that to me is just a joy to hear, because that's really my agenda. You know, I don't think that governments are suddenly going to change their policies because I've written a speculative fiction novel. But if it makes readers think differently about an issue, or even just be aware of an issue and want to engage with it, then that is an important element of change.
And I mean, I suppose I'm reading into this particular novel, but it doesn't seem like you're particularly optimistic about the ways in which, you know, this technology is taking us. So, you know, is scientific discovery then driving us towards dystopia? I mean, you know, it's quite appealing, isn't it? As you sort of say, it's appealing. Why wouldn't you take the read, Juve? It's this sort of promise of utopia and immortality, perpetual youth and good health. It's not just, as you say, that's one of the differences, isn't it? It's not just that we live longer, it's that we live a long and healthy life, and a young person's life.
Yes.
You know, could we not maybe think more optimistically about this kind of technology, and that it might have some positive impacts? Or do you think, no, this is this is definitely the cause for dystopia?
Well, without doubt, there are positive impacts, because yes, of course, you know, being able to alleviate suffering is a massive, you know, tick, right? And there is huge potential for scientific discovery to do good, as we've seen, you know, across medicine with, you know, vaccinations, antibiotics, you know, education. These are good things, but the issue is, it's not the scientists who make the decisions about what happens or who have the cash to invest. And the reality, I feel, is that we're at a real tipping point for the planet, and the time for sort of responsible action is rapidly running out. So you've got significantly more people on our planet living significantly longer and consuming significantly more. I think I read a sort of the ecologist's view is that by 2030 we'll need 2 planet Earths to sustain us. So, you know, a black swan event like an anti-aging cure could push population predictions off the scale. And as it is, we're already projected to get to 10 billion, I think, by 2056. So this is a difficult situation. And, you know, it would be better if we could perhaps behave a bit more like benign stewards, bit like the culture in Ian Banks's novels. But the reality is, and as Alan and I sort of write a little bit about this in my piece after the book, where I talk about the inspiration for the cure, is that the biodiversity is plummeting. WWF said, I think, the last 50 years, the populations of wildlife have declined by 73%. And a leading person in that movement has said that we are basically the most dangerous species in global history. So something has to shift, because is it right that we just go on and on and on forever, eating up all the resources at the expense of every other species? Is it right that perhaps people that can afford these therapies have them and everyone else goes to hell? Is it right that we invest a load of money trying to live longer when there are millions of people dying of completely treatable diseases like TB and malaria and HIV? So I have hope, because we are a smart species that can adapt, and we have the technology to make things right. But at the moment, that is not being implemented. And, you know, I think the power mongers of the world need to really understand that, you know, we can't keep behaving like locusts and expecting the crops to keep coming back.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful kind of message. It's I mean, makes me think that this text, it's not what I would call kind of an eco-critical text, but yet that the implications that you discuss certainly, you know, raise those kinds of questions. And I think it's not that the environment is absent here, but it's sort of it's implied more than
Yes,
it's explicit. And I think, you know, I think that's another interesting aspect of this that you draw out. I think our time together is running a bit short, so it not on your part at all, but I've come to the end of my allotted questions, and you've given me some great answers. So I think as well in order to not just keep talking and talking forever, which I think we could
sure.
do, because we do age, unlike some of the people
Exactly.
in your novel. We could finish with I always ask our guests to talk about a text that maybe has inspired you or that you would recommend to someone else to read. Could be a novel, a movie, or a piece of criticism. Might be something you've already mentioned, but might not be. Yeah, something about utopia or dystopia that has inspired you.
Mm. Well, I would have to go back and I have to The Handmaid's Tale. If anyone hasn't read it, you absolutely should. It's more relevant than ever. And then also, you know, Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Because we are in the era where I mean, it's incredible. He wrote that decades ago, and we are in the era now where I went to a talk on AI governance literally 2 days ago, where we are going to have to regulate whether AI has rights, because we're at the stage where sentient AI is a reality. So I think these texts have a huge amount to teach us about some of the challenges we're currently facing.
On that terrifying note, thanks so much for coming on and speaking to us, Eve. That's been really great, and thoroughly
Thanks
recommend
for
the novel.
inviting
It's
me.
out now. You can go to your shop and buy it, or you can buy it online if you want to give Jeff Busk a few more dollars. Um,
Sure. By Jeff
um,
Busk.
Indeed. But yeah, thanks so much for speaking to me. I've had a really great morning chatting to you, and I'm sure our listeners will get a lot out of this interview.
Oh, I hope so. Well, thanks so much for inviting me on. It's been great fun.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Eve for coming on to the podcast. The Cure is published by Orinder Books and is available now in bookshops and online, so do give it a read if you have found our chat with Eve to be interesting. Honestly, the book is such a great page turner. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do let us know by rating and following the podcast, leaving a comment, or sending us an email. We've got some brilliant episodes coming up, so please do join us for those where we will delve into some more utopian and dystopian fictions.